Thank you, Mr. Machila. Like Prof. Mbata introduced, my title of presentation, that is Indigenization of Postgraduate Scholarship, seeking a cultural, epistemological, and contextual relevance. This presentation will go as follows. Indigenous scholarship. I have modified a little bit the abstract that I sent before. Second point will be about my background and becoming aware of issues, thinking anti-colonial paradigm, supervising researching in and dynamics of indigenous contexts, dynamics of researching in indigenous contexts, a few examples and efforts made, and reflections on the postgraduate program. This is a list of my work that I have done this far amongst the book chapters that I have contributed in numerous books internationally down to local. These are the recent ones. This is about myself. So these were published between 2016 and 2020. The Africanizing of the curriculum, the first one on the left there was published in 2016. The second one, 2017, which is a practical follow-up to the first one. And the next one, Teaching Technology, was published last year. It targets technology teachers. And the next one is the one that was mentioned, was published just recently in August, Decolonization of Technology Education and Addressing Research Challenges. This was published, my apology, that was published a little bit way back in 2015. Becoming aware of the issues, my background and becoming aware of the issues. I was born and raised in South Africa, but both my parents are descendants of Zimbabwe and from the Shona tribe. And the place of my birth and boyhood, that is a little town in the far northwest wards of South Africa called Rooiberg, indicated with the red in the map of South Africa at the corner on the right side. And my schooling career up to tertiary suffered the otherness. I remember during my school days, when it came the end of a quarter and the class teacher was reconciling the register, they would call all the cultures represented in the class. And in the end, myself and a few others would be referred to as others, and we would have to stand, and our colleagues would laugh at us as those who did not, who looked like they did not have culture. And I became worried by the programs that are devoid of indigenous knowledge systems as I proceeded in my schooling career, reflected on where I grew up close to the nature, the names of the trees, the names of the rivers, the names of animals. None of those was represented in what I was learning in the school curriculum. And I came aware of the polarities of development that are perpetuated by the schooling system, and particularly the contribution of education and research to this problem. And I was exposed to diverse contexts and treatment of indigenous students, including those in diaspora. I've been to different contexts, including New Zealand, Australia, and the United States of Africa, UK, a number of countries. And I became worried by how educationally students were treated. And the project that I'm doing as a result of my worriness on a national space, I'm leading a project which I started in collaboration with Mathematics, Science and Technology Agency in the province of Mpumalanga, where I do pull in master's and doctoral students to research partly on indigenous knowledge systems. It is one of the most rural provinces, but with the richness of indigenous knowledge systems. And regionally, I have involved scholars from a number of universities in book writing. And the recent book that was published in August, I have those scholars who have contributed contributed chapters into that book. Internationally as well, I belong to an international group of prolific scholars in the field of technology education, where we target the conferences, and we will stay behind for 2 to 3 days to discuss our work and critique each other's work. And I have written articles, book chapters, books that I've just shown you, some of them, conference papers, and my website on the last bullet there. It's a recently developed website. I'm still populating information into it. And I'm the editor of Action Learning and Action Research Journal, which has got a large global subscription. And I serve on numerous academic boards and committees. And the issues that worried me, I also located within the literature. And I would actually advise that you look into this scholar, Data, who claims that decolonization is an ongoing process of becoming, unlearning, and learning regarding who we are as a researcher and educator, and taking responsibilities for participants. Western research without decolonization can be referred to as oppression towards indigenous communities if Western research does not honor and or consider decolonization as significant and scientific. It can lead to economic inequality, displacement, loss of traditional lifestyles, and significant damage to many indigenous communities. That's what Wilson in Data is claiming, and I fully agree to that. Western research is a model of research where the researcher comes in, takes what he wants, and leaves when he feels like it. That's what Lincoln in Belt claims. It sounds ridiculous, But I can remember scholars like Linda Smith, who's the active voice of the Maori culture in New Zealand, who says our stories are stories about decolonization, how we experience it and what it is doing to us. And at times we may be a little bit radical talking about it, thinking about the atrocities that it has inflicted upon us. Then there are two pillars of decolonization for those that engaging in this project and in the field. One, the system of education is deeply colonial. Decolonization is to help people, therefore, to understand where colonialism came from and unpack it from their own perspectives. Decolonization, that's number two, is recovery from colonial impact, restoration of indigenous peoples' identities, languages, and experience. The next point after that is that decolonization is a lifelong learning process. Like people claim education is a lifelong learning process. If you engage in decolonization as a scholar, one could ask why are we still crying about this? Why are we still voicing our worries about colonialism? Because we are in democratic South Africa for more than 20 years, for an example. If you take my country as an example, it's because we have inherited systems and establishment of colonialism, as were designed by Western cultures. Therefore, like I said, our story is a decolonization story, according to Linda Smith. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I'm the coordinator of a master's and doctoral program in the College of Education that is at UNISA. What you see in this slide is the sites of UNISA, but I want to draw your attention to the mission, to the vision of the institution, which is towards the African University shaping futures in the service of humanity. And if we claim that is what we envision to achieve, it therefore goes without saying that we are busy with the transformation process at UNISA, although we are not as yet satisfied that we have exhausted all the transformation activities that we need to engage in. But with particular reference to postgraduate program, I will later share my sentiments about that. The picture that you see at the bottom right there is the main entrance to the university, which is called Korong. In a traditional setting, a Korong is a compound which is fenced off by means of logs, shrubs, and thorns. To enter, one needs to use the designated entrance called a Korong. That's the kind of entrance in that in a traditional setting. It is a meeting place where the community is called together to discuss matters. And in Tswana, it's called Lekotla. In Zulu, it's called Imbizo. And these would actually inform the ideal practices within the education and research space that we need to follow or to cherish. And thanks to the organizing committee to have come up with an idea of a seminar on indigenous epistemologies. That's a good start. My apology that Professor Ngulube's face is appearing here, but it's for a good cause. When you enter UNISA, these are some of the indigenous scholars that you will meet that are at work transforming the spaces with their work. They have done quite a lot this far. I need not to say all of them's names, but some of you might know them. Starting on the top or bottom left is Professor Wisilem Sila, followed by Professor Ngulube and Professor Ndiovu, Professor Mahano, Professor Litsika, myself, Professor Shava, and Dr. Michela. This leads me to talk a little bit about a postgraduate program. Though a taught program, postgraduate program is a heavily research-oriented program which produces research reports. The dissertation and thesis components allow some degree of flexibility during the course of their study, therefore allowing opportunities for students to maneuver their research problems. But this is dependent to an extent if you will allow the driver, who's the supervisor. That's why I'm putting a question there next. But do supervisors allow them to do so? And if so, to what extent? Postgraduate program, unfortunately, is dominated by Western, if dominated by Western paradigms and, is dominated by Western paradigms and theories. For an example, in my college, there are very few theories that almost every student would think without thinking critically about it. When they propose their research, they would always go for that particular theory, like the common one being constructivism, without even matching it to the research that they want to do. Or if they do, they will not actually research like they are African indigenous scholars. They will not want to make sense of the theory from an African indigenous perspective. Therefore, students tend to mimic their supervisors rather than research for their communities. Therefore, if a supervisor is looked at only as a symbol of academic authority, then it makes sense if you dissect the word supervisor into super, meaning very good, pleasant, or excellent, which suggests a top-down approach that the supervisor is good and perfect. And we have seen some of the supervisors not even allowing the students to come into the project as critical scholars. The moment they challenge their supervisors go and hide behind their authority and think that students want to supervise them in turn. Visor means a part of a helmet or cap which can be pulled down to cover the face, like the picture suggests there. Therefore, barring the other voice or intellect to actually come into the mix. Student training at this level channels students into the Western research approach. Professor Merstens yesterday talked about the 4 tenets of a paradigm, that's ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology. I will allude a little bit to that with each one of them. And please allow me, some scholars talk of post-colonial paradigm. I have chosen to term it anti-colonial paradigm. And with regard to ontology, this is about a reality and worldview, which was quite elaborated by Professor Merstens yesterday. And she also alluded to the relational aspect when it comes to ontology. But what I want to highlight to you here is the combination into the worldview with spirit beings, spirit powers, spirit guardians, and spirit animals, and in an connected way between the spiritual and the physical worlds. And this has got serious implications on science, for which the Southern world has actually suffered the conceptualization of science from the West, which actually dismisses the spiritual component. And if we are going to succeed researching as indigenous scholars or affirming indigenous knowledge systems, we will have to make peace with the fact that spirituality is part and parcel of indigenous people's lives. Spirituality is an underlying framework, therefore. In Setswana, we therefore say, with regard to reciprocity, molomo o jang oroha omongwe, maboho dinku a tebana, sidikwa kinchwa pedi hasetata. All these three proverbs allude to the fact that there's a need for collectivity, that we derive our energy from working together. And therefore, it is important that we are going to listen to each other's stories, that we are going to enrich each other's worldviews in an academic space. The picture that you see on the bottom right here, for example, is the painting by the Bushmen. I happened to visit Lesotho 2 years ago and toured the cultural village and the cave where they lived and painted pictures of this nature. And they so much regard eland, the animal, as an important source for food. But not only that, they also connect a spiritual component to the eland. They so much respect the animal that even in the process of killing it, they would actually pay homage to it and perform some rituals so that even when they eat it, it will be peaceful with them. And they are able to study it, to actually read other patterns of nature from it, like when it will rain, when it will not rain, and things like that. With regard to epistemology, knowledge is fluid and is shared from generation to generation, especially through storytelling. There's perpetual experiences, therefore, with regard to environmental knowledge and one's own body, which are respectively called exteroception and interoception. That is what is within you, and that speaks to spirituality, emotions, and your psychic as to how they actually experience the external in a more tranquil manner, and therefore that guiding how one should carry oneself towards nature. So indigenous knowledge systems denote a holistic approach to nature as informed by nature itself. Therefore, we've got to treat it in a respectful manner, because nature is gone, then we are gone. There are contextual happenings that suggest that knowledge is from experiences with context. And therefore, when we train students in the postgraduate level, or even down before postgraduate level, we've got to excavate from their own experiences, which are quite contextual, and how beautiful that can make learning to be, whether it is shared from people's context to enrich one another and collaborate going forward. The happenings through rituals and ceremonies come in the form of things like dreaming, visioning, meditation, and prayer. There are therefore practical application of the inner space discovery of oneself. And here, elders and other indigenous knowledge practitioners' roles are very, very important, not to be shunned away. There are overlaps and divergences of epistemologies. I have listened to people saying indigenous knowledges differ. Yes, I agree with that. However, in my work this far, I have come to conceptualize indigenous knowledge at 3 levels. The first level, second level, and third level, which denote cultural expressions, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa. The first level, therefore, representing the commonalities that one can pick up across cultures and ethnicities of indigenous origin. If I were to make an example, it is so common of Africans, Black Africans, that whether they are happy or whether they are not happy, they sing. And the concept of Ubuntu also cuts across that. Second level is a dialectical level, which shows minor differences from that go a little bit away from the ones that are common. And the third level is that which, if I say I am Zulu, then I know I'm totally different from Tswana culture or someone from another culture. With regard to methodologies, methodologies share assumptions with transformative, from an indigenous point of view, transformative research paradigms. They are decolonial. That's what Chilisa claims. They are multi-methods from diverse knowledge systems, expressed through or methods of orality, experiential, acting, dancing, and music. They do not necessarily derive theory from written texts, and this is very important, my beautiful audience, because we are so bookish in our or textual in our approach, so much that bewitched by the scientific understanding as it is perceived from the West, we think authentic knowledge is that which is only available in books. What do we make of oral traditions, stories, legends, language, and artifacts? There's a relational accountability. Knowledge is relational and is shared with all creation. Therefore, the indigenous methodologies are collective engagement defined by a sense of commitment to others rather than to oneself. I involved the concept letsema, which speaks to cooperative. We've got to cooperative and engage. I remember during my boyhood, my mother would take us into the fields to work the fields, and we would, in the process, be taken to a spot under the shade, and we would be given food in one big dish, and we eat together from there. That's what speaks to letsema. And that as we eat and do activities together, it generates that energy, and we are able to perform at our high eps, to actually perform the duties as we should. There's a practical nature of knowledge, therefore. One always seeks to use it. And therefore, I have coined the word in my writings, technology, trying to express the practical sense of indigenous knowledge. And we have this author, Julia Watson, who has written a book and collected indigenous designs, which she calls low-tech, that is local, traditional, ecological knowledge. And she engages the framework radical indigenism. What you see in the picture there, she, coming from partly from her work, is the bridge design somewhere in India, where the local community uses the locally available natural resources to make bridges. And this is to address the problem, especially during monsoon weather conditions where rivers are overflooded. It has made them to think with the leadership of elders as engines of this knowledge. Now, they identify the roots. Why are these called root bridges? They are root bridges because they are built upon trees. And with years, these trees grow deeper into the soil, testifying the durability of the bridge. And now they can walk across the rivers without any problem. With Axiology, which is inclined more in values, ethics, culture and principles, it is people-driven and participatory, and respect for individuals and communities, and reciprocity and responsibility. The intent is to support the community, and it wants to achieve respect and safety for everyone. And it's not it's non-intrusive treatment, because one have got to be part of those that you engage, your participants. By observation, observe them and reserve your own judgment. Be emic in your approach rather than ethic. And have deep listening skills and hearing with more than ears. Hear with your emotions, hear with your psychic, so that you don't see yourself as an outsider, but as part of those that you research. And engage in reflective judgment, honor what is shared, and keep to fidelity to the group or community. It drives cognitive, emotional connection. It's not just speaking to the head, but to the heart as well. One is self-aware and engaging as an indigenous scholar. And one is open about one's subjectivity. A much contested element of research from Western scientific position. Positivists do contend that it has got to be more objective than subjectivity. And the question is, are we subjective always as people belonging to different cultures? Therefore, I switch now to supervising, researching, and dynamics of indigenous contexts. This should be a culturally responsive research training that we offer to developing scholars, our students to be specific. If it is a Western research, it requires adaptation to fit indigenous contexts, and both the participant and researcher should benefit from the research and not only the researcher. Disciplines are seen as subcultures. They have their own language, concepts, tools, credentialed practitioners, etc., and may create a disconnection from practice and clear responsibilities towards participants, confuse the neutral position as a researcher with regard to those elements of research in the field: data collection, data analysis, follow validity and reliability of collected data, etc., which are strictly academic-based research guidelines. They follow those kinds of guidelines with invisible power over people practice, and they are not connected with the practical life, people, or culture. In most cases, research that is disconnected from people beautifies the library shelves, and it's not benefiting those that have been researched. The researcher's responsibility is to center the participants' values and follow their protocols, rather. Data was confronted by an elder in one of his research projects. Why are you doing research and for whom? How can we, participants, benefit from your research? And I allude to what data is saying, and I call that kind of research which show little interest in those that are researched, a hit and run kind of research. Data poses a question: is academic research all about deceit for our own interest or purpose? We should listen to participants with empathy and act on their issues. We must also make an effort to add participants' questions into our research. In one of Data's project, his participants demanded that he add a question into his research. Therefore, we need to consider a different approach to selecting research topics, preparing research proposals and guidelines, significant issues that are important for the community versus the researcher's objectives or academic research goals. In most cases, we are seated in our homes or offices and we plan our research and we carry it into the field and we engage warm-bodied people as though it's a blueprint I have concluded about my research problem down to objectives, and I'm not going to even invite them to conceptualize the problem that I have identified with them. We need the kind of research that is participatory and which is action-based if we are going to succeed, decolonize the research space. Therefore, the question holds, who owns the research findings? And we are proud to claim we have discovered or we have found. Whereas elders in indigenous communities have a different take on this. In data research, these questions came through, or reflections. The elders stated, we cannot discover knowledge, rather we learn from our land. We cannot discover anything, we can only learn. Scholars are learners, not bosses. If I share our knowledge with you, you should not say that you discovered it. If you do so, it will be stealing. So we need to free scholars, those that we train, in particular in the context of my presentation, the students, from the fixed Western and academic mindset. The participant in data research thinks of Western research thus. Researchers are like mosquitoes. They suck your blood and leave. So we need action-oriented and participatory research that focuses on participants' voices than on the researchers' academic priorities. We need to collaborate across disciplines. And this speaks for adopting approaches informed by our diversity rather than university. We need diversity or pluriversity. We need interdisciplinary research to accommodate various perspectives. Therefore, we are confronted by fundamental questions that data pose. How can the researcher interact with the participants? How can the researcher build relationships with the participants? Why should the researcher care about the participants' feelings? How can the researcher follow the community protocols? How can the research own findings? How can the researcher recognize the participants' community needs? How can the researcher share research with the participants' communities? This comes to both the supervisors and the students to reflect upon. Western methods and ways of knowing are not the only true science. We should be aware of that. We must break down the barriers between researcher and researched and deal with the emerging ethical and intellectual property rights issues. Research as a decolonizing or indigenizing researcher, anti-racist theory and practice, cross-cultural research methodology, critical investigation, land-based approach should be adopted. Therefore, one would partly view research from a decolonial perspective as not totally free from a political stance or intellectual activism. It has got to transform from science-oriented researcher to participant-oriented researcher, and redefine the meaning of science and research from and within the community through collaborative research, collective ownership, doing collective data analysis, making collective presentations, publishing collectively, researcher as we. and elders and knowledge holders should come into the picture as well. In most cases, one is worried by the fact that we collect the data and that's the last time those we research have seen us. I have pulled a few examples and because of time, I will not go through all of them, but let me highlight the efforts made by South Africa. The country embarked on a project way back in 1996 to audit indigenous technology in the country, which led to the design and development of a indigenous knowledge policy document, which was approved by Cabinet in 2004. Professor Mishack was leading that project. And therefore, we have, as a result of that, the National Indigenous Knowledge Systems Office, housed in the Department of Science and Technology. And we have other initiatives, such as where we started with our democratic dispensation, our national constitution, premised on principles of democracy, social justice, and equity, equality, non-racism, non-sexism, human rights, and human dignity. These were later captured as informing the school curriculum, of which indigenous knowledge systems is one. We have initiatives such as was mentioned by Professor Shiza in his presentation yesterday, the initiative by the National Research Foundation, which has got a specific focus area. And we have a journal, Indilinga, African Journal of Indigenous Knowledge Systems. Then elsewhere, there are efforts to try and decolonize the university curriculum. The University of Queensland University of Technology is one example, and I've provided the authors at the bottom of the slide there. You may consult those authors. It will be good to read about the initiative taken by the university. Briefly, they developed a B.Ed program, and don't think I'm going out of the focus of my presentation. It's because we may not only start at the postgraduate program. The scholars that we train at that level should have started also. Transformation should have also started from the lower levels. So the B.Ed program was transformed totally in that particular university, with an indigenous scholar leading the transformation. Then in the context of Philippine, we also have a culture that came very strongly by Kidoran to actually establish a school for indigenous knowledge and tradition, and came up with the curriculum that is outlined in this particular slide. And it goes on to this slide. And when you move to China, this is quite an interesting one, where from a collective point of view that I've been trying to emphasize, the professors of the university and a few invited from outside started on what we call a program qualification mix, and invited not only other stakeholders, but students also to develop a master's coursework program, and which actually was premised on indigenous culture and epistemologies. Therefore, up to what I have presented, I took a stance to reflect on the postgraduate program, not only within my university, but broadly. We need to relook into the program to ensure it does not compromise indigenous knowledge and cultures. We must approach the program as a decolonial project and engage students actively. Sustain the seminar on indigenous epistemologies. This is specific to this seminar, colleagues. As you have it annually, the suggestion is to have a standing seminar on indigenous epistemologies per se. Also, we may consider a specific postgraduate program on indigenous knowledge systems to ensure transformation and redesign the approach to field work in indigenous contexts, starting from the research problem to methods to avoid the rape or mosquito approach. We should confirm our research problems with those that we target as our participants, so that they are part and parcel of the process right from the beginning down to the last, including even doing analysis with them. One shouldn't be 100% happy that you have collected data and you are back in your room or in your little space and you are analyzing alone. To some degree, that may misrepresent the exact meanings and voices of those you sourced the data from. I know for some, to account for the trustworthiness of your research, you've got to go back and do member checking. But that might not be enough. What would be even much better is to even analyze with the participants in the research. We must use participatory methodologies and other methods which do not compromise indigenous knowledge. We must supervise and or research as a learner than a discoverer. We must supervise or train students as knowers, not as subjects or passive recipients. We must engage in transformative and reflective scholarship. It starts with us to think about what we are doing, for whose benefit, and for whose intended purpose. Research should be a voice for the voiceless. Hence King Shirley stating, nothing about us without us. We must redefine the science to reflect, to free developing scholars from the cognitive clause of viewing research in Western terms. We must involve elders and knowledge holders. This is very serious, colleagues and everyone in attendance. If you take the case of South Africa, for an example, at the national leadership, Contra Lesa, that's the Council for Traditional Leaders of South Africa, is recognized. But then when you trickle down into institutions, representation is almost zero. And it's a high time, if we are going to truly live the vision of UNISA, for an example, talking my institution, it's a high time that we should, like it was alluded by one of the presenters yesterday, to actually rope elders and knowledge holders from indigenous communities in to guide our practice as well and engage with us in research. We must value the interdisciplinary approach to research. We must form a community of practice or club in indigenous knowledge systems. Spirituality is real as part of indigenous knowledge. Research must respect it. We must promote indigenous scholars by citing their work. We should not shy away from reporting research from the first-person style. No one knows your story as you do, and you must own your research. Then in the end, we should deal with the following questions. Whose knowledge gets legitimized in research? Whose findings are they? Where is the participants' voices in your research? How do you deal with and report a community-owned knowledge? Are you researching from your own academic fulfillment? Are you researching for your own academic fulfillment, promotion, integrity, profile, or to uplift or emancipate communities? Whose intellectual property rights to protect? What is ethics from what is ethics from an indigenous perspective? Who examines our students' work? What is the examiner's scholarship, convictions, and paradigm? Ke a leboha, dinotenda. Thank you.